I'm going to talk to you about the 2008 Supreme Court decision. It's the District of Columbia versus Heller. Now, in that, it was concluded or decided that no, you did not have to be an active part of a militia to have your gun rights secured in the Second Amendment, which means, you know, like Alabama, I believe, call it the state militia, whereas others call it the National Guard. And we spoke about this before. These are part-time soldiers. They receive a salary, and the weapons are owned by the government. And it includes, you didn't have to be a part of that, in which we've talked about that. We already knew that a Second Amendment militia is everybody who is able, who has a weapon, who could come together in the time of crisis. In fact, that is stated in that case. Now, I'm going to read over one section, and I'm gonna post it in the comment section so you can see what it is. And if you want to download the PDF file on the District of Columbia versus Heller 2008 decision, you can. Now, see, I did. It's like an excerpt. I did separate some of the material because some of it really is not related anyway. It's like it gives you, it cites, you know, court cases in the past, and one part where it talks about, you know, people who can be denied guns, like felons, or that you can have laws that say you don't have guns in certain places. But otherwise, you know, I just skipped that for right now. And it said, we also recognize another important limitation on the right to keep and carry arms, Miller said. As we explained, that the sort of weapons protected are those, comma, in common use at the time, comma. Let's stop here for a second. Now, here's where I have a break. So, the type of weapons, they're saying, the type of weapons that are protected by the Second Amendment are those that are in common use at the time. Okay, we'll come back to that. Now, it says, it may be objected, or it may be argued, or you could disagree, but it may be objected that if weapons that are most useful in military service, like the M16 rifle, for example, and the like, it says, if they may be banned, then the Second Amendment right is completely detached from the Prefatory Clause. You have the Prefatory Clause and the Operative Clause. Now, that clause, the Prefatory, and I say that 3 times fast, that's the part where it says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Then the Operative Clause is the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So, anyway, that's what that means. That's saying that it's based on, the Second Amendment basically based on the well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. We've talked about that before. I think basically what drove the Second Amendment is the security of a free state, and the militia is just a mechanism by which the people who have their guns can come together. But at any rate, we have it in legal terms: the Prefatory Clause and the Operative Clause. So it says, so it may be argued that if weapons like the M16, military weapons, can be banned, then the Second Amendment right is completely detached from the Prefatory Clause, or, you know, the right to keep and bear arms. Now, let me stop this for a minute. It's important that we don't try to separate these, and this does not. This case does not separate that. And the reason is, and it does state it, that the whole of the United States having weapons that could fight can come together. So that's really important. So them being tied together is important. So your right to keep and bear arms, if it's by itself, then by all means they can limit you and your weapons. But anyway, let's go on. We find some interesting stuff here. We'll get back to that though. Okay, so it says again, it may be argued that if weapons like the M16 and other, you know, military service type weapons like that can be banned, then the Second Amendment right is completely attached from the part about the militia. But as we have said, the conception of the militia at the time of the Second Amendment for avocation was the body of all citizens capable of military service who would bring the sorts of lawful weapons that they possessed at their home to military duty. And that goes on to talk about, it says, and they suppose that for a militia today, let me just read that. It says, it may well be true today that a militia to be as effective as militias in the 18th century would require sophisticated arms that are highly unusual. Excuse me 1 minute. Okay, indeed, it may be true that no amount of small arms would be useful against modern-day bombers and tanks. But the fact that modern developments have limited the degree of the fit or the, I guess, or the capabilities of the militia. It says, regardless of that, it says the right to keep and bear arms, or rather it says, and the protected right cannot change our interpretation of right. Now, I mulled it up pretty bad. So it's just saying, even though they were saying that to be as effective, we'd need real sophisticated weapons, maybe even what normal people don't have, but nonetheless, or it goes on to say, and even that we may not be, as a militia, very effective because you got aircraft and you got tanks. It said, even though that is true, it says we still cannot change the meaning of what the Second Amendment says at the time it does. So they're not trying to break it apart, and they're not trying to change it. It's still there that there may need to be a militia, and we may have to come together one day. But here's a few points I find interesting. Let's go back over it a little bit. It says that the type of weapons protected are the ones in common use at the time. And it said it may be objected, argued, or, if you have a disagreement, or somebody might say that, well then, if you can ban, see, I misunderstood this first time I read it, and it's going to be hard for me to explain it. I thought he's being like taking an opposite position, like saying, well, if we shouldn't ban these weapons because they're needed. That's not what he's saying. But he's basically saying he agrees, I think, with the ability to ban, let's say, a military weapon. But it really is against the argument, the whole argument he's making about the militia. Because he said it might be objected that if weapons that are most useful in military service, which is what a militia is when they're called up, you are in the military. It says if they can be banned, then the Second Amendment right is completely detached from the part about the militia. Now think about that meaning. But he goes on to say, he says again, but as we have said, the conception of the militia in the time of the Second Amendment ratification was the body of all citizens capable of military service who would bring the weapons they had. That's what I want to get to. It took a long time to get there. In 1986, they banned automatic weapons. So it's no longer legal to own M16 or any other military-style weapons. Now here is the problem with what they're saying. That's okay to do that. But then they say, but the weapons protected are the ones that are common in use at the time. Well, how can they ban weapons, which is what you would need to be effective in a militia, which is a military weapon? They ban that so you can't own it. Then turn around and hold to a conclusion, well, it's the kind of weapons that are commonly in use of the day. Well, an M15, for example, that is a semi-automatic version of the M16. That is greatly in common use today. But they're still trying to talk about banning such things. But that would be protected. That's protected because we have a lot of them. They're in common use today. But my point here is, why don't we have the M16? They arbitrarily said we can't have it. You understand what I'm trying to say? I'm muddling this up a little bit. It's hard to get all this, and it's running long. I think the time, but they ban a weapon, which is the type of weapon you would need if you were called or if you were needed in a militia. You become a fighting force. You need that weapon. They ban it and then say, well, that's not the kind of weapons available. Well, obviously. See, because they're saying that, well, nobody would ever made it and ever sold it. That's almost like saying that. I think manufacturers would have made it, and if people had the money to buy it, they'd buy it, and they would now have an M16 as opposed to the M15. So the fact that they ban it and say you can't have it, that doesn't take away from the fact that you would want it, or take away from the fact that you need it or may need it. And they talk about, well, in the time of the ratification of the Second Amendment, people would bring whatever weapons they had. Well, that's true. Anybody would do that today. But that didn't mean they couldn't buy military-grade weapons. Because, it's pretty much just weapons. They all had the same standard. But see, today, no, you can't do that. And this has only been, 32 years ago? So I hope you understand my logic. They turn around and say, the kind of weapons protected are ones that's common in use. But then they ban weapons, which is what you would need in the first place. But they think, well, that's okay. We'll do that. So anything else that's left over. Okay, so whatever's left over. So we have the M15. And of course, now they're wanting to push on that. But the M15, obviously, is in common use. And there's been a lot of cases over the years where that's come up. So, long story short, the M15 should be protected. But otherwise, the M16 should not have been taken off the table, because that hindered the ability of a militia, if needed, if we ever needed to come together. And, you know, but that's sort of what, you know, and it doesn't mean a law, because the law is passed doesn't make it right. I mean, what the truth is what the truth is today, yesterday, today, tomorrow. It always will be. So anyway, I muddled that pretty bad, but hopefully you got the point of what a Second Amendment militia is. No, you don't have to be a part of one. You don't have to be on anybody's roll, anybody's list. But if you ever needed, you called up. But we would need the best weapons. And M15 obviously is what we have right now. But if they hadn't outlawed or made it illegal in 1986, the M16, I'm sure we probably could find that would be a very common weapon in use today.